Coming up is John Coleman. Let me share my screen and show John's profile. His profile is very modest. John and I, we work together 2 or 3 joint clients and we are keep in touch. I learned a lot from John. John is also a very active practitioner, thinker. He's always discovering and learning new things and I will pick up his brains. He's got some of his credentials. You can see there. Agility chef, meaning he's not somebody that will just follow recipes. He understands the context, the organizational setup, and then work with the organization to create the right way forward for the organization. Without further ado, I'll hand over to you, John, and let you take over.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Nader, for inviting me to this conference. I've been enjoying all your talks as well, and I see a lot in common with the thinking as well. So we're either all on the wrong track or we're maybe onto something, I'm not sure. Hopefully we're onto something good. So I'm an agility chef, as Nader mentioned. I coach most of the time. I do some training as well. I find that my training is more effective if I practice more. So I practice a lot, and most of my practice is a combination of non-tech and tech, usually very large organizations, well over 10,000 employees, typically international global organizations. What I want to talk to you about today is, do we need to simplify things? And do you think you can think of the delete button on your keyboard? And in a sense, I'm talking about that, but it's not as simple as that. But if you're looking for some simple metaphor, there's a few things that progressively we might need to delete over time to make things easier for us. You can see my Twitter tag there. I'm also on social media. Generally speaking, if you just search John Coleman, Agility Chef, you'll find loads of stuff and podcasts and all that kind of thing, which I'll show you later. The first thing I want to mention is that there are lots of solutions on the market for teams or teams of teams, for example, Scaled Agile Framework and the various roles, Lean Agile roles and so on. There's a whole school of thought in product management. You've got managers and leaders who are receiving this change of agility in their organizations and hopefully very active and part of it. You've got coaches and trainers and people are into scaling, and eventually maybe people do a little bit of descaling as well. For me, I was really struggling to find something that helped with executives. What I'm going to be talking about today is some of the aha moments that I need to observe before I consider talking about more advanced topics with executives. Of course, when you're dealing with executives, the most important thing is to try and build a relationship and establish some trust. If you can do that, you're off to a great start, and you can ask about what problems are we trying to solve and what opportunities are we trying to avail of and what are the pain points with the executive and so on. So I'm taking all that as a given, that you have a relationship, you're establishing trust, and that you're not in a situation where you're not even getting FaceTime with the executive, which happens sometimes, and I'm not immune to that problem. It happens to me times as well. What we're trying to zone in on today is the assumption that maybe if our executives aren't in the right place in terms of the way they're behaving and the way they're acting, it could impede our ability to achieve agility. And I love what Klaus Leopold says in his book, Reinventing Agile. He talks about agility not being a team sport, that it's actually a company sport, or you could say it's an organizational sport if you're not in a commercial organization. So that's what we're going to zone in on today. And if you're brilliant in talent like Nader, you don't need any of this. Just ignore everything that I'm going to say to you. People like John Seddon is brilliant, for example. He just go in and he does what he does. That's all good. He doesn't need to wait for people to reach certain aha moments or delete things. He's absolutely brilliant at it. If you're like that, go for it and just ignore what I'm about to say. Maybe not ignore some of the thought leaders that I'm acknowledging here. And there's quite a few of them, including that. I'm not going to read them all out, but I've been collaborating with these people for the last number of years. And I've interviewed some of these people on my podcasts as well. And also, of course, the wonderful leaders and coaches that I've worked with and that I continue to work with. In fact, only yesterday I had a little inspiration from a few coaches I work with, and they might recognize a little expression in here that I'm kind of borrowing or stealing, shall we say, legally stealing from them, giving them some acknowledgement. So what am I talking about? When I talk about an executive, what does that mean? It means different things to different people. Essentially, someone who's been appointed or given some responsibility in the organization to manage the affairs of the organization. They've got the authority to make decisions within their specified boundaries, and they probably own the direction of travel. And rather than expecting other people to justify investment for that, they're probably justifying investment themselves. They understand that if you want to reduce costs, one great way to reduce costs is is just to close down the business and we don't need to do any more, we reduce our costs. So sometimes we need to invest. And when people are thinking about ROI, return on investment, a lot of people forget about the I, and we do need to invest to continue to be a long-term proposition for our customers. So some of the examples of executives, the context of this talk could be someone who is a chief marketing officer, could be chief R&D officer, chief financial officer, could be a CEO, could be a chairperson, a board member, could be a regional president in a really large organization, could be a government minister or secretary, a chairwoman of a global nonprofit organization, an executive leader for a chunk of an organization, a really large one, could be a leader within a division or firm, or could even be a leader within a small or medium firm. It could also be her minus ones. That's a crucial point, actually, because a lot of the time when we work with executives, we need to be cognizant of the culture that we're operating within. So, for example, we know in different countries in the world, we've got different cultures and there's even subcultures. And alignment, while that might feel like an over-controlling thing for some people, alignment is important, but sometimes alignment at all levels is important depending on the culture. And you might have actually convinced, or I'm not really in the sales convincing business, but you might have got someone to the place where themselves decided to do some change or to make some intervention, but their reports haven't been aligned and then it falters. So a decision is made. No sooner is the decision made, but the decision is unpicked. And you mightn't even be told that the decision is unpicked. Also, for coach as well, if the coach working with this exec is not quite on the page you want him to be on, that can be limiting in terms of what we can expect out of the executive and ultimately maybe what we can expect of the organization. So I'm going to be talking about the big lie, and I'd love you to add onto the chat window in terms of agility. What do you think the big lie is, if there was a big lie? Keep an eye on the chat window here. There's a lot of big lies, but try to think of big, fat, juicy ones. Self-organization works easily. Just give me more stuff. We're agile now, so we can do more stuff at the same time. That is a kind of a big lie. I agree, Andre. But there's another one, and I guess it's an opinion, really. Who am I to be the judge of what's the big lie? But my own view is that you are empowered. I think that's the big lie. You are empowered until you're not empowered. You're told you can do this, you can do that, and if there's any problems, manage them yourselves. And by the way, if you have a problem and you push it up to me and you escalate it up to me, I'm just going to push back down because you're empowered. That's not really true. So we're going to talk about that in terms of how we get to that place. I'm not saying that empowerment is the be all and end all, but it's a common misunderstanding, and it can be quite disappointing for teams as well. There are some lovely techniques for figuring out how much delegation you have. Delegation poker, for example, from Management 3.0. Andrew's come back again saying you have autonomy, but please check all decisions with the CEO. Exactly. Spot on. Autonomy. And there might be a lot of coordinating roles as well, preventing you from having that autonomy. Thank you so much for those answers. I'm going to be talking about stuff that we need to delete. If we hit that delete button on our keyboard, what's the stuff that we need to delete so that we can achieve authentic, sustainable agility? So less of this kind of agility wash, more kind of really going for it and trying to get the benefits from the change. But I've come to learn actually over the years that maybe deletion isn't really completely removing. And maybe even me saying you should delete something, is that in itself also a recipe? For example, me saying you should never push, is that really true? Maybe sometimes we do need to push, but should we try to remove it? Should it be rare? I would hope teams are pulling more than work being pushed into teams. So take it with a pinch of salt when you see me say I'd like things to be deleted progressively. I like the way Dave Snowden puts it, more of one thing and we're trying to delete, so less of it to the extent that it's rare. So that's where I'm going with this. And I'm using a kind of a color scale, if you like. It's accidental if it actually ties in with anything you've seen before. It's not tied in with reinventing organizations or anything like that. It's nothing to do with spark dynamics. It's purely just nice colors. I'm going to go through some level of progression during this presentation. The idea is that before you get into really advanced topics in agility, maybe you need to look at the basics first. Sometimes, by the way, it's not because the person in front of you, the executive, isn't brilliant. She might be the best executive ever, but it could be that in terms of the culture that she's working with, it's difficult and she becomes pickled quite quickly by the environment. Let's say we get pickled within 6 months. That works for me as well, by the way, coaches as well. It can happen. So I need a coach to work with to try and hit my reset button to do that regularly. Let's go through this. The first set of things that I'd be looking for deleting would be, can we stop demands? Can we stop demanding that this work will be done by that particular day? The phone call's already made. The teams haven't even consulted. Here's the date. Just go do it. And remember, I'm not saying never do this, because sometimes you need to do this, but we're saying we were very careful about using this and it's very restricted. We can understand why in a low trust situation, you might want fixed price, fixed for contracts with your vendors, but is that something you want to continue once trust has been established? My favorite one is when a meeting is held with executives and something is verbally agreed. Then the minutes don't come and they're delayed. Maybe 2 weeks goes by, maybe 3 weeks goes by. And the stuff that we thought was agreed in the meeting isn't in the minutes because people have been plotting and scheming over the last 2 to 3 weeks to dilute as much as possible, because in order to avoid conflict, they agreed in front of each other, but then conspired with each other to dilute whatever was agreed out of the minutes. It's almost like it was never discussed. The minutes become what was agreed as opposed to what was actually said. So that can be something that we need to stop. Unpicking decisions is a close cousin of that, where a decision is made and no sooner is the decision made that it's actually unpicked. Maybe because the coach hasn't actually consulted with the minus ones. The leader committing on behalf of the team. My favorite one is lack of prioritization. And I robbed this expression from Jose Casal and JP Bailey, where they talked about causing a denial of service attack on other functions, where you're working in a particular function and the executive in that function doesn't want to prioritize work. He says that he can't. For me, can and cannot is an opinion. They just don't have the courage actually to talk to their minus ones and have the conflict and have that healthy conflict to have the prioritization decisions. And by not having that conversation, their own people are suffering high workload. And not only that, there's a massive amount of work being sent to other functions, the value streams, and akin to denial of service attack that happens sometimes when hackers try to close down your digital business. Also, waiting for perfect information before you make a decision. Has this been done somewhere else? If you want to wait for it being done somewhere else, it will be done somewhere else. And complacency in relation to improvement and learning. We already know lots of things. Learning is more of a consumption thing. I send someone to a training course is not a serious thing that we expect. It's really all about results. And don't get me wrong, business results are very important. And I think improvement and learning needs to be aligned to business results. But when it's done almost to a fault, it can be problematic. What happens if we don't delete these? Well, teams won't see the point of agility. I see this with teams who have Kanban boards that send work off to other teams. We have all the flow analytics. You can see the work aging, got service level expectations. The Kanban people will be proud of what they see, but the team loses interest in updating the board because the work is being sent off to other functions or other teams, and those teams, other functions have other priorities, because not only do we not have priorities, but we don't have synced up priorities across functions in the organization. So teams don't see the point, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then it causes another problem where they don't have the discipline to do dailies or weeklies or whatever it is they're doing, because what's the point? They're just visualizing stuff and we can't make things better because we're just starting too much work. What could you do about this? What would be good places to start? Maybe could we just start having media minutes? If the climate change conference can do it, surely your organization can do it. Just as part of the meeting, make it a section of the meeting where the minutes are recorded. Maybe start looking at the idea of probabilistic forecasting. Maybe you have it available in your tool. Maybe you can look at some free tools that are available on the internet. There's some fantastic tools available already. You don't have to pay any money for them. You just need skilled application. Maybe we could be looking at the flow analytics. Is there throughput, which is the measure of how much work we're getting done? It's not a measure of value. It's a measure of what we're getting done. But are we noticing that our delivery plumbing system is having problems? Are we even paying attention? Maybe there's loads of telemetry and nobody's looking. So can you look? Can you be curious about those? And maybe trying things. I admire leaders who try things. They're struggling. They're still not convinced about something, but they're willing to give something a try. And that's a good step in the right direction. I was inspired by some of my colleagues at a client, and they talked about something similar to this: 9 minutes at 9 a.m. learning. So it's not 5 at 5. It's 5 minutes at 5 o'clock when learning happens after everything else is done. It's like the first thing you do at the start of every day, and maybe even ask your organization to change Outlook so that people can't book meetings until 9:15. So you get that 9 minutes at 9 every day. Maybe practical things that you could try. Then if we look at the next level, let's say you've managed to get rid of those other things, but now we've new issues. They've always been there, but the next things to look at. One of the patterns I notice a lot, which really troubles me, is when I'm making progress with teams, they're doing really well. And when teams do well with agility, they go through an element of stress actually, because they're bumping up against the rest of the organization that isn't there yet. So there's this kind of old world and new world thing. Then when their fabulous boss gets promoted to another part of the organization and they put a command and control boss in her place, that creates problems. Inflicting help on people. Tom Meller, the famous certified Scrum trainer, trainer from Scrum Alliance. He was driving me around and he said, John, don't ever give advice unless people ask for it. He was right, actually. Being a bit too passive about risk management, putting the risks on the risk register. Doing broadcasts, town halls and all that stuff are fine, but as the leader talking to people, actually meeting the teams regularly, not just like a royal tour where people are putting up posters and everything because it's all beautiful before you turn up. No, regular, maybe even unannounced actually at times, to get real and find out what's really going on. And also getting rid of constraint blindness. Earlier today, we had a talk from Clark on constraints and the bottleneck. So do we even have awareness that there's a bottleneck and that's causing us issue? Getting rid of this focus on utilization of people, focusing more on managing the work rather than managing the people and utilizing the people. Stopping this focus on the star performers. If I have Matter on the team, it's all going to be good, and it will be good, by the way. It'll be brilliant. But sometimes we can rely on teams. If we go to our experts all the time, maybe our experts aren't available for everyone. And maybe delusions of predictability as well is something we need to deal with. All of these, in a sense, and some of the previous things that we needed to delete, they can lead to a lack of discipline at team level. People start losing interest in retrospectives and dailies and updating the board. And when the boards become stale and out of date, it's the road to perdition, really. So we need to be very quick at dealing with these things. If we don't deal with them, we're going to have lots of issues with the group. But where do you start? Where could you actually improve the situation? Maybe you could think about, instead of letting us fall 1 foot in the brake and 1 foot on the gas, like going neither here nor there, maybe we could cruise promote with agility in mind. Maybe we could listen, really listen. Before we get into mentoring, coaching, teaching, just listen. And maybe getting comfortable with non-experts starting work, getting more informed on complexity. I talk about non-teams because there are some teams that actually aren't teams. They've been put together as a team, but really they're a group of people who have been told that they should be in a team and they do each other as friends and so on, but actually they don't really care about each other's work at all. One thing that I've done is I've provided guidance. So for example, at a daily, I put in the first question as, what do we need to collaborate on, cooperate on today? And the second question, is there anything that needs a bit of love and attention, some item on our board that we started it, but we haven't been paying attention to it? And is there some work that's blocked on our board? I'm curious where you would start. So if you were in this situation where people were promoting the old guard and inflicting help in you, it's all blah, 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 and just telling you stuff and promoting the high performers, where would you start? I've given you some suggestions, but do you have any other suggestions? Keep an eye on the chat window here for your suggestions. Listening and observing, absolutely. There's a Japanese expression of walking the gemba, isn't there? Or really see what's going on. That'd be a great place to start. Sometimes executives are so stuck on the whatever executive floor they're on, lovely furniture. It's like a rare thing that they actually meet teams. It's like a special thing that happens maybe once or twice a year, but it needs to be a regular thing. Asking questions as well is a good thing. Measuring the impacts. Thank you, David. Measuring the impacts and making them visible. It's important to show that we're making progress. Thank you for those suggestions. So you can see that we're trying to make progress here. We're trying to say, okay, can we let teams be more influencing in terms of when the work would be done, but also can we not only encourage agile type behavior, but also try to make sure that when we're considering about who the new leaders are, that they're not going to unravel the change, the progress that we've already made, that the impacts and the progress that you've already made, that we don't get that unraveled. You can see the colors are filling up as we go along. Then if I go to the next level, this is where there's still not an appreciation that teams need to work together. They need to coordinate their work. Hopefully they do that autonomously, and they might get some assistance in some coaching roles, but as such, they try to do that themselves. If we're dealing with suppliers, hopefully they're like part of the family. They're getting 5-10 year contracts. We're not tendering the work out every 6 to 9 months because some genius thinks it's a great idea to cut costs and the knowledge walks out the door every 6 to 9 months. And maybe it's a time to stop, push, and stop or delete are not absolute. When teams talk to me saying, oh, we've got capacity. Okay, so you think you've got capacity. It's a subjective thing. For me, your capacity is your throughput. How much stuff are you getting done? If you're bringing in more stuff than you're finishing, it's not really a good way to operate. It can lead to teams that are overburdened, feeling tired and not calm. Another suggestion here from Jiva, thank you, Jiva, empathy, having a one-to-one connection to bridge the real gap and genuinely showing the progress that we're making. And the word empathy, Jiva, is interesting because can empathy lead to corruption in a way because we look after the people that we like? A word I prefer to use, and I think this is what you probably meant, is more about compassion, having compassion for people, understanding, and not necessarily people that we know, not necessarily our favorite people. So can we try to reduce the idea of short-lived teams? Projects are a great idea. Projects are needed to get some stuff done. They're short-term constructs to get some work done, unless you're going to Mars or or something. Maybe after a while, teams get used to release trains and release trained engineers and all these different things. Do we need to try to keep them together for a bit longer? Can we almost barcode the product backlog or the program backlog with different types of projects? Maybe we could do some 80-20, 80% of the outcomes or 20% of the outputs. A lack of goal orientation as well is something that needs to be dealt with. In lots of organizations, the focus on projects and programs, which is fine, but there seems to be a lack of intent behind them. At this point, we need to say, okay, we're dealing with our plumbing problems, but as Yogi Berra said, don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. So maybe we need to be thinking about goals. That also creates the space for teams to come up with alternative outputs to deliver those goals, deliver those outcomes. Ruthlessness is fine and it has a place, but should you be ruthless for people or should you be ruthless with value? In Scrum, for example, commitment is not a guarantee. Commitment means we want to do our best. Quality is what's right at the top there. The definition of done is probably the most important commitment in Scrum. Do we have cognitive diversity, which can contribute to cognitive diversity by having diversity and inclusion in terms of the people that we have in our teams? Are we avoiding groupthink? Even with diversity, you can still have groupthink. So do we have people who are thinking differently? At this point as well, we probably need to stop this idea of imposing things on people. Give teams choices. And the good thing about, say, for example, is teams can do Scrum or they can do Kanban or XP, which gives people the choice for how they want to do their work. These are things that we would like to reduce. And I put it to you that if we don't try to get rid of these, we're going to have an environment that lacks humanity. So if you were to start somewhere and if you were to try to reduce some of these, where would you start? What would be some of the ideas? What would be some simple ideas that you could start with that maybe you don't need permission from anybody else? You could just start, you could just do something just to make some kind of improvement. I keep an eye on the chat window here for some of your suggestions. So if you wanted to make a start about removing some of these things, what would be the practical things that you might try? So focus on people and interactions. How about that? And Marcus was talking about that as well earlier today in his talk, a fabulous talk. Thank you, Marcus. People interact, absolutely. Processing tools have a place, but thinking about our people as well. Some other suggestions, Andrew's point, can we let teams actually coordinate at the value stream level? Can their representatives be supported by the various roles who are there, of course, but can they work together? Can we focus on aging, the work that's getting old in the system because the team's saying, I've got capacity, but look at the work that's aging in your system. Just get it finished, get it out the door so that we can get some feedback and find out if we're going in the right direction or not. Product teams might be a big step, but talking to customers and users regularly, that's something hopefully you can do. I hear people saying we can't talk to customers. Again, I would say can and cannot is an opinion. In the same organization, one of my clients, it's interesting that in different functions that there's completely different opinions about whether you can talk to customers and users. And often it's more of a political constraint within the function that you might be in rather than not being allowed to do that. Can you be compassionate with people, but maybe ruthless with value? Maybe can you invite people to the change? And some people, by the way, aren't okay with it. Maybe we need to be comfortable with that. Some people do need to see social proof that it's working elsewhere. Maybe we need to be open to that. And even if we're desperately depending on them, maybe it's better to leave them where they are and treat their work as a dependency to our work. We're moving on. We're moving halfway across the board. The next set is efficiency word. I have to confess, a lot of my clients, that's what they really want. It's efficiency. And I often wonder why they didn't just use lean or theory constraints and the job would have been done. But I don't know. I guess they wanted a new way of doing it or something. Lakoff said, you want the more right you do the wrong thing, the more wrong you become. So can we be more effective? This is the point where we solved our plumbing problems. The place is feeling a bit more human. And now maybe we can get serious. Like Sully said in the movie, Sully, can we get serious now? Can we talk about, instead of talking about the cow that we're milking, the metaphorical cow that we're milking, our current products, can we be looking for new potential the products, cows that we haven't found yet? Do we need to find the next cow? Do we need to get rid of this whole idea of the big bet? Maybe there's not even an appreciation that's a big bet because there's a business case, there's a value associated with it, but it's a bet at the end of the day. According to Marty Kagan, even brilliant product managers are wrong 70% of the time. I'm wrong probably 99% of the time. Getting rid of long-lived impediments. Came across a couple of teams 3 years ago and they each had an impediment that was 7 years old. 7 years old. So can we get serious about looking at that? We don't just accept that things are bad around here. We can do things about this. Scaling is good and it gets you to a certain place, but do we need to think about, is continuous scaling, is that always the answer? Do we need to have a manageable size? For scaling, of course, is not to scale. Do you need to continuously scale to an extent where it gets a little bit unsustainable? Do we need to move away from the idea of initiative budgets and think more about funding where the value is? Do we need to rethink about who's in what seat on the bus? Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. Do we have the wrong people on the bus? And if we have the right people, are they in the right seats of the bus? Maybe we could get rid of this idea of it's about you being better as a Java developer or tester or marketeer or lawyer, whatever it is that you do, there's still a place for that. But can we allow a situation where people have the choice to grow horizontally? We have to be careful about this, because if we create a situation like that, then if I get promoted to another part of the organization and that scheme isn't available, then why would I be part of that growth promotion path? And we need to stop thinking, build it and they will come. We know from the chaos report of the standards group several times over that 2/3 of features are rarely or never used. I had a client a couple of years ago, they built a massive feature, nobody ever used it, ever. So we need to be careful about that. And we need to be careful about the brown stuff in relation to, oh, we're customer centric or consumer centric. In fact, the more people say that, the more I realize that they're not. It's like when people say to you in a room, Marcus talked about this earlier today, about psychological safety. When I hear a leader say we're all psychologically safe in this room, I know that those very words from the breath that we heard just after it, that we're not psychologically safe. So I put it to you that without these deletions, we'll just have a feature factory. Marty Kagan uses that expression, John Cutler, feature factory, like a sausage factory. We deliver stuff, we push it out the door and we give it to the market. We check that it made a difference or not. We might be making loads of money, but do we know what's actually working, what's not working? Do we want to be number 3 or do we want to be number 1? Do you want to be the best or the rest? It depends on what you want in your organization. But I'd love to hear your suggestions. If you were to start somewhere about dealing with some of these things, where would you start? What are your suggestions, please? I'll watch the chat window to see what you think. Here's some suggestions that I came up with. And first one will be allowing dissent, but not to the extent that it's unconstructive and unhelpful, like someone with Tourette syndrome or something. I don't mean that in a bad way, or that in a funny, humorous way. I hope you take it that way. Compassionate dissent. If we really believe that something's a dumb idea, maybe we call that out. Maybe there's a recognition that this big bet is a really bad bet, and understanding that actually. Maybe we need to focus on fixing problems. Maybe we need to think about more regular funding cycles. Bjarte will be talking about that later today, I believe, beyond budgeting. Do we need to think about self-designing teams? Do we need to experiment where the risk of actually getting the value is quite high? That we think the value is very high from these items, these product backlog items we're using, Scrum, Kanban. Maybe we need to take a leaf out of Ellen Gottestiner's book. Maybe we need to discover to deliver. Or maybe, as Giff Constable and Joshua Seidman would hint at, maybe we need to discover to not deliver. Because if we discover that 70% of ideas are wrong ideas through experiments, through cheap prototyping, maybe we could discover the stuff not to build. And for me, when people go on Lean UX training, for example, or design thinking, I think it's actually a very good leadership training, because we're asking people to limit work in progress all the time. We really struggle with that. When you run experiments, you actually find out that some ideas should never be born. What a great way to limit work in progress. Maybe we need to get out of the building. Maybe we need to actually do much more regular customer research. I see a comment here from David. Thank you, David. Maybe validating some long-lived problems are really problems. Yeah, really digging on that. So sometimes we make lots of assumptions. Maybe we can do some experiments on that, do some research on that, focusing on the important stuff and making progress. Thank you, David. So you see, we're trying to make progress here. We could have done this much earlier, but if we haven't sorted our plumbing problem, are we going to be limited in terms of how we can even experiment? Are we going to have too many experiments running at the same time? Are we not going to pick our battles? Getting very agile at this point. Wouldn't it be lovely to be in this place but we still have problems. We still have people making decisions based on gut feeling. Maybe we still have opinions without any evidence. There's no evidence to back up some of the decisions. So being empirical actually means we're using data, not just data, but insights from data to help us make decisions. But you don't want to be doing data-driven decision making either, because maybe we need to, by talking to customers, users, and other internal stakeholders, we understand more context. Often I find when I run a survey with people, going in to get them to do the survey or do task completion on a prototype, for example, that's just it's almost like an excuse to talk to the customer, and I discover other things by accident almost. So try to have those kind of accidents as often as possible would be good. Now we need to be thinking about, and less of this, oh, we need to deliver all this project, we need to deliver all that project, we need to deliver all this and all that. Maybe we need to go more 80-20. And as Patrick Lejoy says, can this be a default question? Can we 80-20 this? If we've got a fast-moving consumer good, for example, we not think we have to do it on all SKUs. Can we just do this change of one of the SKUs actually, and just see how it goes and not boil the ocean kind of thing? Maybe we need to get rid of leaders pushing impediments back down to teams, and maybe it's time for executive leaders to be rolling up their sleeves and being less back-to-back in meetings where they're unavailable to help people, and actually really understanding if they want to deliver more results, if they want to be like a heat-seeking missile to help the teams with their discovery and they're doing. They want people to be faster. Maybe there are some things beyond the control and influence of the teams and they need help. And should we be doing that all along? Absolutely. But for me, there's an element of progression in terms of people even being ready to even see that there's these problems. Because as we said earlier in this talk, you're empowered and all this kind of nonsense when actually maybe you're. We also need to be looking at some of these processes and workflows that are just killing us. It's teams struggling with compliance systems that are written for the traditional approach that are constraining our new ways of working. Can we get sensible? Can we get serious? As Sully said in that movie, can we talk about what are the controls that need to be in place? What are the rules that we need to follow? And what's the spirit of the rule? And what's the intent behind the rule so that we can be compliant? And does that necessarily mean that we need to fill out a particular spreadsheet in a particular way, even though we already have that information on our product backlog in Jira or whichever system we're using? And maybe we need to strengthen up, bolster the growth career path, that you have choices. You can stay a specialist and get better at that. You can become a manager and go that route, or you can grow horizontally. That's a choice. You do quite well, actually, that way. You don't have to, if you want to improve the lifestyle of your family, you don't necessarily always have to go through the managerial route. And maybe at this point as well, hopefully we can ditch this thing. It was kind of hinted at by one of the attendees that maybe this thing about better, faster, cheaper, what is all that? Maybe we need to realize at this point it's about being more adaptive to what's going on in the market. And of course, we should have been doing technical excellence all along, shouldn't we? But the lack of it is really constraining people and upsetting people's ability to really sustain that agility. So this is something that we need to finally push that away. This is the way we do things around here. And Jeff Bezos sent that famous email in 2002 about using microservices and saying that people get fired if they didn't use them. Maybe that's a bridge too far, but that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about, that we have a really high bar in terms of how we do our work. I put it to you that if we don't do these, the potential is more limited than it could be. And I'm hinting here at unrealized value, the cow that we haven't found yet, the innovation, not becoming another Nokia, Kodak, the usual stories. It's interesting that even though we all know these stories, it's still happening. People are still motivated by whatever way they get their bonus, and they're not reading history. It's really interesting. I've got a request for you. If these are things that you wanted to get rid of or make more rare, let's put it that way, what do you suggest? Where would you start? What would be a good starting point? I can see there's another comment from Jiva. Thank you. Try to retain the team. Nutrition needs to be managed well. Absolutely, I agree with that. Long-term, stable teams. Heidi Helfand is doing some good work as well with dynamic reteaming, where if you do have to change team, just get good at it. And I found it interesting that the EU Field Guide for Managing Complexity in the Prices actually cited Heidi Helfand's book on dynamic reteaming. So it was very interesting. And the Agile space, we're looking for teams that trust each other. You can also attain that trust through crews. So if someone arrives who's very well trained, someone else comes along to replace me, if they're trained in the same, another PST or PKT, for example, from those communities that can provide those training, people can be reasonably assured that they'll probably get something similar or less friendly training. Even if they go to ladder for training, if someone who's striving to become an SBCT and someone else who is in a similar kind of kudos there as ladder, there'd be trust there in the system. That would happen. Question from Andrew in terms of deletion. Do we have vision and mission to align everyone? Yeah, absolutely. Much earlier on, I think maybe 2 or 3 levels back, you're talking about we needed to get rid of this idea that we have goals. And now at this point, do we need to think about multiple time horizons? Are we there yet? Is it this step or is it the next step? Thank you, Andrew, for that. And instead of maybe data-less decisions, maybe data-informed decision, maybe treating initiatives as bets. We talked earlier about non-experts starting work, but now maybe we're getting much more comfortable with non-experts learning and doing that. We can see that we do actually get better business results by, we actually get more scale by people having more horizontal breadth to do more things. It might even allow us later on to expand the definition of our product in our teams because we actually are building more capabilities through learning. Maybe we can be thinking about scaling some of our processes and flows. Maybe we can ask some really good technical coaches to mob or swarm with teams. These would be some of my suggestions. Then you can see we're progressing along here. We're getting to the last 2 levels. The numbers are unlimited, they go to infinity, but in terms of how far I got it so far, thinking about the past is a big thing. I really know when I've got an agile leader when they're thinking about the future. They might even be thinking of multiple time horizons about the future. They might even be thinking about 2025. They're not thinking about 2020. They are, but they have somebody else worrying about 2022. Maybe we're not having so much about creating new leadership positions, adding more to the hierarchy. You don't have to have a position to be a leader, you have leadership at all levels. And maybe we need to be less about harming the environment. I don't mean just the kind of cultural environment, but also in terms of carbon and plastic and all those United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Can we do less about that as well? And maybe it's a point in time, the dependencies are the bane of our lives, aren't they? And when you've got layer cake teams, you can expect there to be dependencies dependencies, and more than 90% of the teams in the world are layered cake teams. Have we got to a stage where there's so much learning going on that we can consider slice of cake teams? You can consider that earlier too, but does it feel natural at this point in time? And instead of talking about targets, maybe it's about trends. And targets can be damaging. You could argue this could be at an earlier level, because when people achieve the target, they don't really try to do any more, and it can lead to sandbagging and all sorts of problems. But I put it to you that if we don't delete these things, we can lose some really valuable customers because we're not really in tune. We've got distance from the customer. You might be in a team and maybe you're 14 layers away from a customer. That must have an effect on how well you empathize with the customer. But I'd love to hear your suggestions on the chat window. What do you think? If these were things that we'd like to de-emphasize, where would you start? What are your suggestions? Looking at the chat window, I don't see any suggestions on the chat window. Where I might start is maybe goals in multiple time horizons. Andrew was hinting at that earlier on. Maybe we've got a more congruent purpose. It's not just all about share price and profit and all that thing. And by the way, I think that will come from consumers. I think consumers will be demanding this more. I'm getting much more cranky in the shower. Even when I see all the plastic around me, it makes me really sad. So getting shampoo bars and things like that, like an old bar of soap, but it's shampoo. And that's the kind of extent that I'm going to. I'm finding myself getting irritated in supermarkets with stuff wrapped in plastic. That will eventually, I think it's already hitting organizations, and the demand will come from the market, and we need to be ready for it. And we already talked about trends and slice of cake teams and expanding the definition of our products. We have, for example, Microsoft Excel. We expand our definition to Microsoft Office because we've been not only allowing non-experts to start work, but we've been focusing already on being comfortable with people who don't do that work normally actually picking it up. We're allowing our experts to be more scalable. As Andy Carmichael says, we're improving our labor liquidity. So it's quite a full chart now at this point. I guess the final phase at the moment that I've got to is appreciation of ego. That's still quite damaging. There are lots of companies in the world that are doing very well, but there's still a very strong ego. That is that necessarily a problem? Like I said earlier, it should be more rare. It doesn't mean that you should never have an ego. Backlogs. This is a kind of a hat tip to John Seddon that maybe we don't need backlogs anymore. Maybe a backlog is just another queue. So can we just go and talk to the customer and find out what they want next? Can we have this lack of sustainability? Can we just push that aside in terms of ways of working? We talked earlier about congruence of processes and workflows, but now it's a well-oiled machine, so we can get rid of these last things that are continuous improvement, tenacity. And if there's any hint of a lack of diversity and inclusion, can we just eradicate that once and for all and go for that? It's even the whole idea of a 5-day week, transformations. Sometimes organizations need them to get them started, but can you get to a stage where change and learning is just part of what we do every day? It's a priority. It's not just about business results. We see that learning and change helps us to achieve business results because it helps us to find that new cow that we needed after the last cow ran out of milk. So I put it to you that if we don't get rid of these, we could actually lose some of our best employees. And I'd love to hear your suggestions. If you were to start somewhere, where would you start? What would you do about this? I've got some comments here. End of day happiness, I think is what you mean, Jiva, and how happy people are. If we strive end of day happiness to be the best possible extent, I believe this gets reflected at every level. Thank you, Jiva, for that suggestion. I came up with a few ones as well. Appreciation of compassion at this stage, not so much about ego. Maybe the focus on customer jobs. I had to customer jobs to be done. Clayton Christensen and so on. Maybe more authentic recruitment, thinking about the 4-day week. It's quite a big picture, isn't it? There's a lot of things to delete. And here's the nub, or the rub, I should say. If you find that you're the very start, the very first column, and a lot of those things are still problems, they're still not deleted, what does it mean? We can be patient. We can say we're going to go inch by inch. How long do we have to wait? When we go inch by inch, and then it becomes micro inch by micro inch. Are we continually trying to avoid change, actually? I put it to you that if it's a sustaining situation where a few key executives in the organization are still locked, and we can be patient, but if we're still unlocked, do we actually need to think about deleting the executive? Because I put it to you that with executives who basically create drag for change agents and real agile leaders who report to them, they are damaging their organization. And we might not have to worry about deleting executives. We might be deleting the organization. Open to questions now. If you want to find out more, there's a link where you'll find lots of links to my podcasts and so on. And well, thank you very much for your engagement. I just see a couple of comments here. Backlog, maybe reduce the depth. Yeah, that's another way, another step. Thank you. Is this a linear flow from left to right? I wouldn't say it's linear. I don't think anything in life is linear. Things are far more complex than that. You can make progress. You can do things at a higher, if you like. It's just be aware of some of the things that might still hurt you later. You could find yourself getting impeded. And if you're really outstanding, you don't need any of this. If you're John Seddon, I just go in and do your thing, and you don't need to go through any of these steps.
Thank you. Please take a minute, provide the feedback. It is useful for us, and more importantly, it's useful for presenters to just see how is the message landing and how to improve it for the next time.